The Key to the Indian by Reid Chapter 21, Clanmother's Courage. The men couldn't believe their eyes when they saw this old woman, half hidden by smoke, with her long white hair and glittering squinting eyes, walking slowly with her arms stretched ahead of her, like a blind person marching into the muzzles of their guns, blocking the way to their murderous purpose. They stopped in their tracks. The grins fell off their bearded faces. Their gun arms slackened uncertainly. Then one of the men raised his pistol and pointed at her. "Keep back, ye crazy old heathen!" he barked, but his voice shook. She kept coming, and the other men shrank and backed away. And suddenly she emerged from the wreathing smoke into the circle of bright light from the flaming torch. Now they could see clearly what was in the hands she was holding out in front of her. Omri, half paralyzed with terror though he was, realized what she was doing. The Indians might believe and accept little people, but not these men. Clanmother had seen enough of white men to know that. In a split second of memory he recalled Mr. Johnson, his old headmaster, who had once seen Omri's little people and had thought he had lost his mind. He remembered Patrick's story about the saloon bar in old Texas, the drunks who had seen him, a tiny human, and run away in terror. But one of them had shot at him first. Now Omri and his dad were in the line of fire. He never knew afterward if it was abject terror or cleverness that made him begin to shout and scream, imitating the Indians' war cries, whether his wild gestures were struggles to escape, or what the men perceived, threats and defiance from some tiny supernatural being. Omri was almost level with the men's faces. He saw them freeze into masks of terror as the old woman kept relentlessly shuffling closer. They backed and backed. And one, who had not spoken, suddenly let out an inarticulate shout. His musket dropped from his nervous hands, and he turned and fled into the night. The other one was left alone. He tensed, crouched, caught between two impulses. He looked wild, terrified, like a cornered animal. His pistol, recently reloaded, was still aimed. His hand was shaking wildly, but at this range he couldn't miss. The old woman thrust her hands even farther forward and shook them almost into the settler's face. Omri could see the mustiness of his beard, whiskey on his breath. Omri could smell the mustiness of his beard, whiskey on his breath, the sour sweat of fear coming off him. Omri's throat seized up. He couldn't force out another sound. In one more second he would be looking straight into the barrel of that enormous death-dealing weapon. But old Clanmother had a last tactic up her sleeve. She dropped the arm that held Omri. The gun, pointed at her face, was level. It steadied. And then that withered arm made one last, heroic, wholly unlooked-for effort. It jerked straight up, and Omri felt the barrel of the pistol strike his shoulder sharp and hard. The gun, as it was struck, fired, nearly deafening him, but the ball went high into the roof. The man's nerve broke, and he ran, dropping pistol and torch. That gun was safe, flashed through Omri's fear-drenched brain, but suddenly the man stopped and snatched up the discarded musket. As he was about to disappear through the doorway, he paused one moment and turned back. "Go back to hell, you red devil!" he shouted hoarsely, and fired one last thunderous shot. The old woman stiffened. Her grasp on Omri loosened. Instinctively he wrapped his arms around one of her gnarled fingers. Then he was arching through the air as she crashed backward to the ground. The next few minutes passed in a kaleidoscope of confusion. The women and children came crawling round, and it was like being trapped in a forest of living trees. There were wails and cries of grief. The old woman, who was now a huge motionless mountain on whose flickering shadow Omri and his father crouched, was lifted and carried away. They should have stayed in the open, where they could be seen and perhaps rescued, but their instincts were too strong. Like exposed mice, they fled from the trampling moccasins, and the smoke and noise and danger into the nearest compartment. Scrambling over a heap of furs and other objects, they mounted the sleeping platform, still smelling sweetly and innocently of its sage mattress. They only spoke a few brief parting words to each other. "That wasn't Bright Stars before, the one who—" "No. Where did she go?" "Out with the other men. Don't talk. Help me make a hole in one of these slabs of bark." His dad stared around the football field of a bed and saw something glint. It was a knife, almost as big as himself. Omri watched as he ran to it, stumbling and tripping over the huge folds of hide, and picked it up, dragged it back, and began struggling to piece one of the bark shingles in the outer wall. In the end he got Omri to help him, and they used it like a battering ram. Between them, They pierced and twisted a hole in the bark big enough to enable them to squeeze through and climb down the 10 feet or so to the ground. Omri would have fallen if his father had not been below to catch him. "Come on, we can't stay here. We've got to get away from the longhouse." They ran through the flickering darkness, but after about 200 yards, they were brought up short by a huge barrier. It was the stockade. "The fire hasn't got to this part yet. We've got to get through." They examined it as well as they could in the dark. It had been all too well constructed, the stripped tree trunks so close together that a beetle couldn't have squeezed between them. And above them, the sharpened tops were invisible, twice as high as the longhouse roof, and now lost in smoke and darkness. It stretched interminably away on either side. Which way to run? Neither of them had the least idea, and both were disoriented by fear and exhaustion. They had both been hurt, and their injuries, though not serious themselves, had begun to stiffen and give real pain. The numbness where the pistol barrel had struck Omri's shoulder now began to feel red-hot, and he saw his dad rubbing his knee and grimacing. "Dad, couldn't we just sit here and wait for Patrick? I don't think I can run any more." "I don't know what else we can do. But if the longhouse collapses on us..." They sank down, breathing heavily at the foot of one of the poles. They could feel the heat and hear the sound of burning getting closer. "How do you think those awful men got in?" "They must have been inside the stockade already before the fire was started." "I suppose Little Bear's just forgotten about us," Omri said. "I wouldn't blame him. I just hope he's all right. Do you think they managed to drive the raiders off? I heard shots, from outside." "It must have been the raiders. Little Bear said the Indians had no more bullets." "They had their bows and arrows. I hope they got those swine. They purposely set out to trap the women inside the stockade." After a few minutes, Omri sat up straight. "Dad!" "What?" "They were. They're trapped. The women, I mean. The opening of the stockade is the part that's burning. I think the men jumped through it when it was just starting, but all the women and kids must still be caught inside the stockade, the same as us." "Where?" "They must be at the end, near the other door." Suddenly, through the roaring noise of the fire came another sound. Thwack, thwack, thwack. "What's that?" "I know. Quick, run toward it." They ran to their right, and now Omri could identify the sound, the most welcome sound possible at that dire moment, the thudding of axes against wood. "It's them! It's the men outside the stockade. They're using their trade axes to chop a hole and let everyone out." They ran, keeping close to the poles, around a bend near the corner of the longhouse. There, sure enough, they saw the crowd of women and children huddled together. The sound of their chopping became frenzied. There didn't seem to be any time between blows. They could see which poles were being attacked, because they quivered and shook, and very soon the first of them swayed and screeched and fell outward, leaving a long trunk-shaped oblong through which they could see the night and a section of a man's figure wielding a large axe with a metal blade. 2 minutes later the adjacent pole fell, and then the next. It was enough. The children could now be handed out, the women squeezing through after them. There was no panic now. The evacuation happened in a calm, orderly way. Bundles and baskets were pushed through. Some women were still running to and from the doomed longhouse, rescuing possessions and supplies. At last the bodies were passed through, 3 of them. Men's arms received them, and there was a stunned silence, broken by muted cries of anguish, sorrow, and rage. Then, quite abruptly, everyone was through, and Omri and his father were alone. "Okay, come on. We have to get ourselves out now." The posts had been cut at about twice Omri's father's height. It was still no easy matter for them to climb out, especially weakened and weary as they were. "You go first, bub," said his father, and made Omri clamber onto his shoulders. Then, when he still couldn't reach, his dad took his feet in his hands and, straining, heaved him up to half the length of his arms, till Omri could get a good grip on the shattered top of the stump and haul himself up with the soles of his moccasins pressed against the pole. His shoulder gave him hell, but he did it because he had to. But how was his dad to follow? Omri stood at the top of the stump, surveying the scene beyond. It had seemed very dark at first beyond the stockade, where the light of the fire couldn't reach. But now he could see quite well. He realized there was a brilliant 3/4 moon. It had only seemed dark before because they had been in the stockade's shadow. Omri could see the whole group of Indians at a distance. He couldn't make out exactly what they were doing. Suddenly he saw a man on horseback, and his spirit swooped up. Dad! I can see Little Bear!" he called to his father, still down below, above the increasing roar of the flames. "He'll see me! He'll get you out, and wow, Bright Stars is with him! They've got Tall Bear, they're all safe! Little Bear!" he shouted at the top of his voice. "Little Bear! We're here! Help!" And he waved his arms and danced on the stump. But Little Bear took no notice. He couldn't hear him. He was at the far side of the group. Omri could see him gesturing, calling, neck-reining the pony in and out of the crowd. He seemed to be organizing them. He had a couple of muskets slung across his back, and Omri knew he must have taken them off dead raiders. He wondered fleetingly if he had time to take any more scalps. From the pony's back, he could probably have seen Omri silhouetted against the flame-lit smoke. If only he would look in the right direction. But now he jumped down and was lost among the crowd. And then, in the moonlight, Omri saw an old woman being heaved onto the pony's back, followed by an old man who straddled the horse's flanks behind her. Then a bundle, and with a sudden sickening of the heart, Omri realized they were leaving. Now, tonight. Of course, what else? Their home was burning, most of their possessions and what little safety they had were gone. What else could they do but to start their long, dangerous journey north tonight? In fact, they were moving off. Omri could just make out Bright Stars with the baby on her back, leading the pony at the head of the straggling column. They were going. Omri's dad trapped below and both of them stranded. But that wasn't the worst. They were going without saying goodbye. Omri felt suddenly absolutely certain that he would never see Little Bear again, if Little Bear didn't see him now. And how could he see him when his back must be turned like everyone else's, and he was heading away from the longhouse, up the hill and into the dark wood? And that is the end of chapter 21.